Welcome back to Klepper's Corner, Today in History. April 5th is one of those dates that reminds you history is not a straight line of progress, so much as a drunk uncle with a crown, a musket, and no coping skills. On this day, empires prayed to luck, kings got blessed into civil wars, colonists turned kidnappings into diplomacy, presidents invented constitutional side-eye, and modern governments kept proving that fear is one of the most durable fuels ever discovered. So tonight, let's walk through a few April 5th moments that show how power loves ceremony, panic loves an audience, and humanity has always been just one bad decision away from calling it destiny. Segment 1. Empires, luck, and other government programs. Ancient Rome set aside April 5th for the festival of Fortuna Publica, which was basically the state telling everyone, we built roads, aqueducts, laws, and armies, but at the end of the day, we are still emotionally dependent on a goddess with a steering wheel. I love that. Rome, the civilization most likely to measure a road to the inch and crucify you for parking wrong, also paused commerce to beg public luck not to wander off. It is the original version of a government holding a press conference to announce that while the economy is stable, vibes remain a concern. And centuries later, that same obsession with legitimacy showed up when Lothair I was crowned in Rome in 823. His father thought early coronation would prevent a succession crisis, which is adorable, like trying to stop a house fire by giving the arsonist a nicer lighter. The Pope put the crown on Lothair's head to make his authority look sacred and settled, and naturally, that helped trigger more family war. So in one April 5th package, you get Rome funding a holiday for collective luck, and medieval Europe blessing a prince into future chaos. Different costumes, same message. When governments can't guarantee stability, they compensate with pageantry and hope nobody notices the math underneath is melting. Segment 2. Holy Wars on Ice and the Theater of Power. In 1242, Alexander Nevsky faced the Teutonic Knights on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus, in a battle later romanticized as if the ice itself rose up and swallowed the invaders like nature had signed an orthodox defense pact. Modern historians are less convinced about the dramatic cracking ice finale, but honestly, the real story is better. Nevsky didn't need fantasy. He took heavily armored crusaders, lured them onto slick terrain, let them commit to their terrifying wedge charge, and then boxed them into a miserable melee where their biggest strengths became giant metal inconveniences. It is one of history's great reminders that the loudest force in the room is often just one bad surface away from embarrassment. Then jump to 1536, when Charles V made his triumphal entry into Rome, and the Pope practically redecorated the city like an anxious host trying to impress a dinner guest who had already trashed the house once. Because let's not forget, Charles's forces had sacked Rome in 1527, and less than a decade later, the papacy was bulldozing neighborhoods and exposing ancient ruins to give him a prettier parade route. That is not reconciliation. That is urban planning by trauma response. Imagine demolishing your living room so the guy who robbed you can feel properly celebrated walking through it. One battle used terrain to humble invading power. The other used architecture to flatter it. Either way, April 5th keeps showing us that power is never satisfied with merely winning. It wants scenery. Segment 3. Colonies, captivity, and the birth of no turning back. In 1614, Pocahontas married John Rolfe in Jamestown, a union that later got wrapped in soft-focus mythology because history loves taking hostage diplomacy and running it through a gift shop. But the reality was colder and more political. She'd been captured, baptized, renamed Rebecca, and folded into an English colonial narrative that presented conquest as salvation. Rolfe, meanwhile, wrote like a man trying to convince both God and himself that his obsession was evangelism. And Chief Powhatan, facing relentless war, saw the marriage for what it was: leverage. The result was temporary peace, breathing room for Jamestown, and eventually the secure cultivation of tobacco, which is another dark American origin story. We love to talk about freedom while standing on an economy built by addiction and forced labor. Then, in 1621, the Mayflower sailed back to England, leaving the Plymouth colonists behind after a winter so brutal it killed about half the people involved. Captain Christopher Jones even offered free passage home, which feels like history's least successful customer retention campaign. No one took it. They stayed, handed off letters, and watched their escape route disappear over the horizon. That departure mattered because it ended the fantasy of retreat. Suddenly, all the lofty rhetoric, all the covenant talk, all the survival mythology had to become real. April 5th gave early English America two defining acts: a marriage sold as peace but rooted in power, and a farewell that turned settlement into commitment. In both cases, empire advanced by making irreversible choices sound noble. Segment 4. The Republic learns to say no. On April 5, 1792, George Washington issued the first presidential veto in American history, which is one of those moments that sounds dry until you realize the entire constitutional machine was still basically in beta. The founders had built this elegant theory of checks and balances, but until somebody actually used one, it was just very expensive parchment fan fiction. Congress passed an apportionment bill. Hamilton liked the math, Jefferson hated the math, and Washington, in a rare act of presidential drama, essentially looked at the whole thing and said, "Gentlemen, your numbers are illegally creative." That is what makes the moment so significant. He did not veto it because he was moody, or because cable news needed content, or because a donor wanted revenge. He vetoed it because he believed it violated the Constitution's rules on representation. The first veto in U.S. history was not a tantrum. It was a spreadsheet with moral authority. And then, just 95 years later, another April 5th gave us Helen Keller at the water pump in Alabama, where Anne Sullivan spelled W-A-T-E-R into her hand, and language suddenly unlocked the world. One moment is about a republic discovering the executive brake pedal. The other is about a child breaking through isolation into thought itself. Both are breakthroughs in systems of communication. One taught a government how to limit power. The other proved that a human being the world had underestimated contained a vast intelligence waiting for connection. It is almost annoyingly inspiring. April 5th says institutions matter, language matters, and sometimes the most revolutionary thing in history is not a cannon or a crown, but finally finding the word. Segment 5. Industry, scandal, and the price of respectability. The Mammoth Mine disaster in Pennsylvania in 1891 is the kind of industrial horror that built modern America and then asked widows to be patient about it. A methane explosion killed 109 men and boys, many of them immigrants, in a system so negligent it treated human beings like interchangeable parts with accents. The fire boss had declared the mine safe that very morning, which is a level of bureaucratic irony so brutal it almost reads like satire. Bodies were mangled beyond recognition. Families lost breadwinners, and only afterward did Reform Energy gather enough force to pressure the state on mine safety. It is the classic pattern. First the profit, then the funerals, then the hearing. 4 years later, on April 5th, 1895, Oscar Wilde's libel case against the Marquis of Queensberry collapsed, and with it, his public life. Wilde had sauntered into court as if wit alone could beat a hostile legal culture. And for a while, he treated the trial like a salon with stenographers. But when the evidence of his private life turned the room against him, the case inverted instantly. He went from plaintiff to prey. The same society that adored his plays could not wait to erase his name from the billboards while still cashing ticket receipts. That is Victorian morality in one perfect package. Consume the art, destroy the artist, and call it public virtue. So on one April 5th, laborers were buried under the cost of industrial prestige. And on another, a playwright was buried under the cost of social respectability. Different victims, different machinery, same cruelty. Society loves refinement right up until it becomes inconvenient. Segment 6, Panic, Empire, Terror, and the Iconic Modern Collapse. In 1930, Gandhi arrived at Dandi after the Salt March, having marched hundreds of miles to challenge the British Empire with the most dangerous weapon imaginable, making oppression look ridiculous. That was the genius. Not a bomb, not a coup, not a secret manifesto, salt. The British had built an imperial tax regime so arrogant that Gandhi could expose it by walking to the sea and preparing to break the law with beach residue. It was anti-colonial resistance as devastating public demonstration. If your empire can be humiliated by a pot of seawater, maybe the empire has bigger problems. Then, in 1951, the Rosenbergs were sentenced to death in the electric chair, the Cold War turning fear into theater and the justice system into a voltage-based loyalty test. Julius was implicated in Soviet espionage. Ethel, far less clearly so. Yet the government pushed forward anyway, as though executing a mother on thin evidence might somehow stabilize the republic. In 1955, Churchill resigned, the giant of wartime Britain finally yielding to age, only for the future to arrive in the form of Anthony Eden, which is history's way of saying the sequel is rarely as good. In 1986, the Lebel bombing in West Berlin turned a nightclub into a proxy battlefield of global terror and retaliation. And in 1994, Kurt Cobain died, giving a generation already suspicious of fame one final confirmation that mass culture can commercialize alienation right up to the grave. Across these April 5th moments, whether it is empire, paranoia, terrorism, or celebrity, the pattern is brutal and modern. Systems under pressure reveal what they actually worship: control, fear, image, survival, and sometimes all four at once. In conclusion, April 5th is a date filled with ceremonies meant to create order and crises that exposed how fragile that order really was. Romans prayed for public luck, because even empires know they are one bad harvest from chaos. Medieval rulers sought holy crowns that only made family bloodshed more legitimate. Colonists, presidents, teachers, labor organizers, revolutionaries, propagandists, and artists all collided with the same problem in different centuries. How do you hold a society together when power is unstable, truth is contested, and human beings remain gloriously irrational? History's answer over and over is that people build myths, laws, rituals, and movements to survive uncertainty. Sometimes that creates justice. Sometimes it creates disaster with better branding. But on April 5th, more than most days, history feels like a long argument between symbolism and reality. And reality keeps winning in the rudest way possible.